Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Especially now, let me translate in the name of God, the most merciful and compassionate, because I'm going to be speaking about sacred silence and compassion as I was assigned. I only have 20 minutes to speak, and I shall have to summarize because I want to say some things which were, I think, skipped over in our discussion of the last couple of days and which I feel are significant if we're going to be honest with ourselves on the subject that we're discussing. But let me begin, first of all, what I alluded to yesterday. I cannot presume that the audience will be the same, and that is that, metaphysically speaking, silence is not metaphor, symbol. I would use the word symbol rather than metaphor. The symbol of the non-manifested and non-creative aspect of the divine principle, what the Kabbalah would call the Insof, what Islam is called that, the divine essence. Christian Uzya in certain forms of Christian theology, and of course Atman in Hinduism and other traditions. We could go on. And the supreme Tao, which cannot be named, and now that Tao that cannot be named is not the Tao, as the first verse of the Tao Te Ching refers. So we have this silence, which is ultimate reality. And even modern scientific cosmologies, on which I don't base too much value because every 10 years they change, but for the moment, most of the physicists talk about the Big Bang. What is before the Big Bang? No bang. It's silence. So even that affirms in a sense that the bang comes after silence. And I said yesterday, the word of God, in the beginning as the word, or kun fayakun of the Quran, implies a breaking of that primordial silence. And that is why it is sacred silence. It's not to be confused with the ordinary cessation of speech or noise or sound in our world. That is the supernal silence which contains all manifestation. If we can compare the whole of the cosmos to sound, as many Hindu cosmologies do so beautifully, you can say it is a silence that contains all sounds. And on the basis of this, I want to turn to a very important Islamic teaching which we did not discuss, I have not seen it discussed in this conference yet, which contains, in fact, the relationship between silence and compassion. And that is that the reality of all things was contained in the divine knowledge, in the divine intellect, as possibilities of what we call archetypes. Not in the Jungian sense. Jung did not understand the word about archetypes, but in the metaphysical sense of archetypes, of the ideas in the Platonic sense, and the divine knowledge. And in that state, these possibilities had not smelled the perfume of existence. As Ibn Arabi says, La shamma ra'ahat al-wujud, these archetypes. And then God breathed upon these archetypes the breath of compassion, nafas ar-Rahman. And through the breath of the compassionate, breathing upon these divine possibilities, which was before the world of existence, all existence came into being. So we are really all, in our substance, the divine compassion. Our very substance, our very existence, according to this cosmology, is Nafas ar-Rahman. Ar-Rahman is a divine name meaning the compassionate. It's in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And so metaphysically, compassion is inseparable from existence. To exist is to swim in the divine compassion. And we exist because God decided to cast his compassion through the breath, nafas, which symbolizes, in fact, the breaking of that primordial silence, in order to existentiate everything that exists. And this everything does not mean only a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist or anybody else. It does not mean only human beings. It does not mean only animals and human beings. It means all of existence. What we call animate and inanimate, which is somewhat of a superficial division, although in profound at a certain level, and conscious and unconscious, which is also a profound division at a certain level, but superficial on others. Certain Hindu cosmologies, everything has a form of consciousness. So embracing everything, embracing all things. And spiritual realization is nothing other than the undoing of this existentiating act, going back where we came from, and therefore going from sound to silence. And here, the source of sound, which is the sacred silence, made available certain sounds which return us back to silence. As I said in my comment earlier this morning, the divine names of God, certainly in Islam, were not invented by men. They were given by God himself. In the same way that if I have several friends of mine sitting in the first row, I call their name. I say, Gray, she will say yes. Mrs. Henry was sitting right here. In the same way, God has given himself the name Allah in a particular revelation, the Islamic revelation, by virtue of which we say Allah he hears, because he's the all-hearer. It's very symbolic here, significance, how the sacralization of various divine names depends upon the tradition which use those names. So Judaism remains silent about the supreme divine name, as my friend Rabbi Green just said. But in Islam, God chose to give himself the name Allah and the other names that are in the Quran, and by these names, he hears, he responds. And it's very interesting that Arab Christians in the Arab East, in their Eucharistic services, in services, especially Catholics, always use the word Allah for God, for Deus. They don't use Latin. There are many Arabic masses. People do not know, even Paris has one church which has an Arabic mass. That's many Catholics, of course, in Lebanon, other places, Jordan, participate in it. They use the word Allah, but Allah does not have that sacramental efficacy of returning us back to silence among the Christian Arabs as it does for Muslim Arabs, although using the very same word. So the efficacy of sacred names depends upon the sacred universe in which they're made sacred. And every religion has its own means of returning us back to silence. And we use using the symbolism of sound because we talk about silence. We talked about mantra this morning, but there are also barks, vehicles for return to silence, which are themselves silent, like the mandala upon which you meditate and contemplate in Hinduism and especially in Tibetan Buddhism, which is so important. And therefore, we cannot limit the means of returning to silence only by sound and sound systems, although this is extremely central and important because it was by the sound that the universe was created. And the method of japa, dhikr, nimbutsu in certain forms of Buddhism, all based on the ejaculatory practice of invocation and prayer, are central actually to the returning of human souls from sound to silence. In Sufism especially, it's not enough to be silent. One must also make a joyful noise unto the Lord, as Christians say, in the form of ejaculatory prayers, and especially the dhikr, the invocation, which is the supreme means of returning us back to our source. But let me come back to compassion. We don't have too much time. Our time is up. I want to bring up some difficult points. First of all, we spoke very little about the truth during the last 2 days. Can there be compassion without truth? No. There's no compassion has any value and spiritually has any efficacy without truth. One can be compassionate for the person who makes error, who is in error. One cannot show compassion for error. That undoes the reality of the spiritual world and ultimately religion itself and the social order. One could argue that one of the most important causes for all of the chaos that we observe in the world today is to separate charity from truthfulness, which unfortunately many Christian thinkers began to do from the 18th, 19th century onward. In the name of being charitable, we accept somebody saying 2 and 2 is 5. The word heresy is now no longer used. It's not in fashion. And the word falsehood is no longer used except in science. Only in the physical science and mathematics, you have falsehood. Nothing else is true and false. Everything is gray. We live in a world of grayness. Part of that is natural to human existence, but part of it is not. In all religions, charity and compassion were always related to truth. And I think that if you're going to do a service for those present and those who are going to reach this message through all the modern means of communication that are available, the internet or whatever it is, that this be emphasized, that all authentic compassion must be based on the truth. Now, that means also not to keep silent always in the face of error. It's not everybody's vocation to speak against error, but a person who has been given that vocation by God and the capability to do so and remains silent for personal reasons, for selfish reasons, when the truth is negated, is endangering his or her soul of losing not only the virtue of compassion, but ever returning to that sacred silence in peace. It's a very, very serious and important matter. I'm not saying one has to shout every day in the street, but each person, according to his or her knowledge, station, capability, possibility, always faces a situation in which error comes parading as truth. And to just pass it by in order to be charitable is one of, I think, most dangerous errors that the modern world faces. And especially the religions are responsible more than anybody else. Let me start with my own. When people desecrate the tombs of companions of the Prophet, as they did outside of Damascus last week, with money paid by oil-producing countries and supported by this country and England, and nobody in the Islamic world says anything except 10 people, they're as much to blame as the people who did it. And I'm just taking a case of Islam in order not to criticize other religions. But this is unfortunately a fault from which we all suffer. Because I love Hinduism so much, I've been to India so often, it's like my own country. Let me just give one example. When 3,000 Muslims were burned to death in Gujarat a few years ago, the trial is still going on. 3 or 4 of the great Hindu sages said something. The rest all were silent because they were either afraid or for some other reason. And I even read an article published in Delhi criticizing why is it that all these great Hindu sages talk about compassion and so, but nobody's saying anything. And we have this going on over and over again. And this is related also to the separating of compassion from justice. Nobody talks about justice anymore either, unfortunately. God is merciful. He's Ar-Rahman in Islam, but he's also just. There is a justice in the universe. Without justice, nothing prevails. Even the laws of physics are a physical reflection of metaphysical laws of equilibrium and justice. Justice is always related to equilibrium. And you cannot separate compassion from justice in its totality. You cannot be only compassionate about the people in your town, but don't care about the rest of the world. Apply justice only to a small segment of people with whom you're directly related. And this is something which we're all to blame for. All to blame for. It's really a disgrace to be human these days. When all of these people are burned in Burma, the Rohingya Muslims, nobody speaks about it. Nobody speaks about it. It's a very, very good tragedy, terrible tragedy that in Boston, a city which I spent 15 years of my life and studied there and taught there, that this horrible event took place. 3, 4 people died, a couple of 100 people were wounded. That's terrible, and the things that were said were all correct. However, every week that passes, with the money paid by taxpayers in this room and elsewhere, dozens and dozens of women and children are killed by drones in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Nobody talks about it. What kind of compassion is this? This kind of compassion cannot have any spiritual efficacy. Compassion must be related to both truth and justice. If it is, then it's a great virtue. But if it's partial compassion, I'm very compassionate about the neighbor down the stairs, but heck with somebody else. And this even applies to the suicide we're committing vis-a-vis the environment. So, or as long as the Ohio River is not polluted, I don't care about Yangtze River and Ganges, they're far away. Who cares about that? But all these waters are interrelated. One day the pollution of the Ganges River is going to kill us as it's killing people in India. And this partial compassion, which is part of the ego about which I spoke yesterday, that only wants to see itself and its immediate interests, is one of the most difficult walls to break, to overcome. But we live in a world, it's not like the Middle Ages where people in France did not know what was going on in Japan. We live in a world in which we have no excuse. Either we must have compassion for all or not to claim to have compassion. Otherwise, we're not fully human. And I really hope and pray that His Holiness, whom I've known for 50 years and was a young man, who said so much about compassion all over the world, his coming here will re-emphasize this for everybody, that compassion is not a partial thing. The Bodhisattva did not take the vow to take his other foot into nirvana until the last blade of grass was saved, only for the grass in his backyard. It was for all grass in the world. And that attitude, which is so strong in the teaching of the Buddha, that compassion is for all creatures, that another way Christ said, love thy enemy. In the Quran, in all sacred scriptures, in Judaism, so many verses of the Old Testament speak about this. We must have a compassion for the whole, otherwise let's stop fooling ourselves. We cannot live in hypocrisy. We cannot live in hypocrisy and claim to be spiritual people. We cannot live in cocoons anymore. This is how God has placed us here on the earth for the moment. That's where we are. Every day we hear what's going on all over the world. Perhaps in older days, people were very fortunate they never heard these things. But now we do hear them. We must be concerned with them. We must be concerned with not only the whole of humanity, but the whole of creation. It includes the whole of the environmental crisis. That our compassion has always been for the human species, and not even that, the whole of human species, just our nation, our religion, our people, our neighborhood. We've disregarded compassion for the rest of creation, and here's the result that we see before ourselves. But anyway, in this very difficult period, dark period in which we live, the remarkable miracle is that the holy bark sent by sacred silence to take us back from this noisy world in which we live back to the sacred silence is always there. Happy is he or she who takes advantage of embarking upon this boat and returning to the silence before nature and death silence us beyond our will. Thank you.